Hi again, everyone. Thank you very much for your patience. And welcome to today's webinar, Is Process Design Still Relevant? A Higher Ed Perspective. My name is Cecile, and I'll be one of the co-hosts for today's presentation. And joining me on the call is my colleague, David Mainville. David will be the moderator for today's panel. Today's webinar is part of our Perspective series and is focused on higher education. In the coming weeks and months, we will be having additional webinars on other industry verticals, such as healthcare, financial services, and government. What I'd like to do as we're getting started, and before I hand things over to David, is do a little bit of housekeeping to make sure that we have an opportunity for an interactive session today. On your screen, you should have a GoToWebinar control panel. And in there, you'll have a section for questions. So if at any point today you do have a question about something or you'd like to make a comment, please feel free to enter it in there. I will be moderating throughout, and I'll make sure that we get your comments and your questions into the discussion. We'll also be conducting one poll, and so that polling question will appear on your screen and you'll be able to answer it as well. As we're getting started, I just would like to do an audio and video check. So I'd invite you to put your name and where you're joining us from in that GoToWebinar control panel in the question section. Just to confirm for us that you can hear and see the screen okay, and you can hear our audio okay, and then we'll be ready to get things underway. Okay, I see we're having lots of folks letting us know that they're good. Brad from Detroit, Henry from Dallas, Raquel from Houston, Dwayne from New York City. Oh, lots. We have lots of folks. That's just super. Thanks very much, everybody, for letting us know. And at various points throughout today's presentation, David will be asking for comments from the audience. So this will be the place where you'll be able to put those comments in. Before we get started, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about Navvia. Navvia has been in business since 1999. Originally, we started out as an IT consulting firm, helping organizations like the New York Stock Exchange, Bank of New York Mellon, Deloitte, and others design robust business processes. In 2009, we took that experience and launched our software product, the Navvia Process Designer. And Navvia is one of the most cost-effective and innovative ways to design, document, and publish IT or business processes. Navvia was specifically designed to help organizations save time and money when it comes to designing and documenting their processes. We've been recognized by Gartner as a cool vendor and most recently published in the Market Guide for Enterprise Business Process Analysis. And on the screen there, you can see examples of some of our great clients. So David, I'd like to hand things over to you so you can get us started with your introductions.
Well, thank you, Cecile. And can you hear me okay?
I can. Thanks very much, David.
That's great. Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for attending today's webinar. And I also want to thank our panel for taking time out of their busy schedule to be part of today's webinar. Just by way of introductions, my name is David, and I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders here of Navvia. And I've got a career that spans about 37 years in IT, a lot of it focused on process as a practitioner, as an architect, as a consultant, and more recently, working with Navvia, helping to build the Navvia Process Designer. So let me go in and now introduce some of the panelists, and then we'll get into the meat of the presentation. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Eiland from Columbia University. Eiland, could you spend a moment just giving us a little bit of your background?
Yes, I oversee the portfolio management and the service management offices for CUIT, which is a centralized shared service IT organization at Columbia University. We're staffed about 300 plus, and we provide services to the various schools and institutions and administrative staff.
Thank you, Eiland. I'd now like to introduce Vince from Texas A&M Technical Engineering Extension. So Vince, can you give us a little bit of your background?
Sure. Sure. I'm the CIO for Texas A&M Engineering Extension Service, and basically I have worked in a variety of topics within IT. Currently, I'm over the organization that supports the Engineering Extension Service. We have a centralized service. We manage all the basically the enterprise level applications. We do allow some of the departmental units to manage some of their own applications following a set of practices that we really have set up. So we end up with a hybrid approach. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you, Vince. And I'd now like to introduce Vesna. And Vesna, could you give us a little bit of your background, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I work at Stanford University in University IT, which is our central IT department, specifically in the service management office. I've been working on the ServiceNow implementation project for a little over 3 years now. We started this project to replace Remedy, which is our current ITSM tool. And I was heavily involved in the redesign of our ITSM processes when we launched the project. Currently, we have our central and almost all of our distributed IT groups on board to ServiceNow, and we're going to bring on our first non-IT group, which is our financial management services, in January 2018. So we have quite a bit going on right now.
Sure sounds like you have your plate full. All right, so thank you, panelists. What I'd like to do now is give those of you in the audience a chance to introduce yourselves virtually, so to speak. So Cecile's going to launch a poll, and it's basically just going to ask you what your role is in respect to process design. And the feedback from that poll will help us get a better understanding of the audience that's out there today and make sure that we can steer today's conversation in the correct direction. So okay. Cecile, we can go ahead and launch the poll, please.
Here we go. So folks, you will see in the GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see the poll was launched, and you do have the opportunity to select one of the items. I will also mention while you're voting, we did get a question about the recording of today's session and the slides, and I neglected to mention that during the introductions. We will be sending out the slides from today's presentation and a link to the recording to everyone who attended, and also to those who registered but were unable to attend. And you are certainly welcome to share that with your colleagues as well.
On that same note, often there's a lot of questions that come up in the webinars. We're going to do our best to get to every one of the questions, but if we can't, because of time limitations, we will make a point of getting back to everybody with an email, and we'll share those emails with all the attendees.
Great. Okay, I think we've got everyone, so I'm going to close the poll, and then magically, I believe I can share the results. And there you go, David. Looks like we've got process owners, process managers, and process analysts joining us today.
So it's a pretty much, I wouldn't say an even split between the three, but 36% process owners, 24% process managers, and 39% process analysts. So a good mix of folks here on today's webinar, and that's really helpful for us so we can frame our discussion in an appropriate way. So moving on to the discussion itself, the way the format's going to work is we have 5 questions that we're going to place to the panelists, and then we're going to go do a bit of a roundtable. As the panelists provide their responses and we have a dialogue around those questions, we also invite you, the audience, to basically comment in the chat box, and we'll take some of those comments and bring them into the discussion. And if there's questions as well, we'll bring those questions into the discussion. So again, this is really meant to be interactive. So if you do have anything you want to share, Cecile will be monitoring the question panel, and she'll be able to interject with your comments and your questions. So the first question is around the state of process. And, I'm somewhat biased. I mean, I've been an advocate of process for my entire 37 years, and I see so many ways that process helps improve business outcomes. But, process tends to go through cycles, and sometimes it's considered in vogue, and other times it's considered higher, bureaucracy or impediment to getting things done. So the first question today I'd like to pose to the panel is process alive and well in your organization? So I'm going to start with Eiland for this question. Eiland?
Very much so. As I mentioned, my area of responsibility is the portfolio, traditional project management, and the service management offices. There's several initiatives that are underway for us this fiscal year. At the IT enterprise level, we have several ITSM-based process implementations or improvements that are planned. We have continued expansion, for example, of our service catalog request items. We have new implementations for some of our customers in the areas of problem, knowledge, PPM, SDLC. And then at the program and the project level, at least I would guess that almost 40% of our effort entails some form of process reengineering and automation.
That's great. How about you, Vince?
Process is pretty alive here. Folks don't necessarily like to call it process, I would say. My organization oversees the development of a lot of the enterprise projects, along with the the general IT service management aspects. And really, kind of what we found is folks really just don't understand what process is when they believe it's kind of out of vogue. So they understand the steps, they understand the needs that you have to meet along the way, but they just know it by a different name. And so being in an IT organization, obviously you're always asked to automate something, and you have to really understand the process. And we spend a lot of our time really helping the process owners understand definition of process and better defining those. We have a lot of improvement projects going on right now. We're re-implementing several major systems. We're also in the process of, we've been on ServiceNow for a few years. We're really bringing on some additional modules at this point also.
So you mentioned people have some difficulty understanding what process is. Could you elaborate on that just a little bit more?
Sure. I think folks end up believing that process is extremely rigid, and that it does form that impairment to being able to achieve things. And what I really think is folks get process confused with procedures or work steps. Mm-hmm. If you look at process in a more general sense, process is the things that you have to get accomplished, and then how the inputs and outputs come through a process. You might have individual tools, you might have individual procedures that are an impairment, but I don't think it's really the process itself. And that understanding, defining roles, and defining what has to be achieved along the way really helps improve the way things flow through the organization, really helps, brings visibility, and it really helps with kind of that stewardship of the funds that you're entrusted to.
It really does drive outcomes, doesn't it?
That's correct.
So Vesna, your role, you're very much focused right now on the automation of process. Given that, what's your perspective on whether or not process is alive and well at Stanford?
It definitely is here at Stanford. I think people think that process means it's overly bureaucratic. So the key for us is looking at how we've implemented the process, so that by virtue of people doing their work, they're following the process with not necessarily needing to understand every single bit of it. And they do tend to confuse process and procedures. We get that all the time. And one of the things that we're focusing right now is KPIs and metrics and gathering information. One of our leaders always says that you have to have the data to tell the story, basically, because otherwise you only hear one side of the story. So you hear people saying, well, this happens to me all the time, and I don't want to follow the process because that happens all the time. But when you look at the data, it's really only happening once or twice, but to them it feels like a bigger impact. So we're using that information that we're pulling from people that we're hearing to drive those process improvements, so people will be less reluctant to follow the processes. And we've set up some governance groups to help with the process. So it's very much alive and well at Stanford.
So what would, and Alan, what would you think, given that a process seems alive and well in each of your institutions, What's one of the biggest pushbacks you seem to get when it comes to process? Is it the technology? Is it organization? Is it funding? What are some of the things that your number one challenge in terms of getting process implemented?
I would say it seems there's I guess a feeling that it's somewhat bureaucratic, and that touch on Vince's points earlier, that it can be sometimes a hindrance to speed and getting things done quickly. I would say that is probably the top issue, and you just have to kind of fight through that for the most part. And you're right, to Vince's earlier point, it goes by different names, and so trying to reposition how you message this is important. But I think the number one issue, to answer your question, is that it somewhat seems as bureaucratic.
Vince, Vesna, anything you'd like to add to that?
I agree 100%.
I agree. Really education.
Education. You know, often one of the things that I think helps is really explaining things in terms that each individual group of stakeholders understands. And one of the things people often don't realize is process, or the outcomes that someone's looking for from a process, differ based on who you are. So if you're in the executive ranks, what you're looking to achieve versus if you're in the technical ranks, what you're looking to achieve. And often we try to explain things in technical terms to the executives or in business terms to the technicians, and people don't understand the with them, what's in it for me. So sometimes communicating what's in it for each individual stakeholder group can be very beneficial in helping overcome some of those objections. Anything from the audience, Cecile?
Yeah, actually, there were a couple of things that came up, and just general consensus about the confusion around process and process getting a bad name. You know, a lot of confusion with technical people who think that process is out of vogue, and that recognizing and how to recognize or reconcile process engineering versus documenting process guides. They equate the process work only with the physical deliverable. We also had a comment, you know, can we really, we can say that process is doing well in organizations. Communications takes time and not always the sweet spot of the various roles in IT, so it's not necessarily our strength. So yeah, lots of good comments and from the audience there, David.
Thank you. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. So the next question that we have here for today's panel is, what's your organization's approach to defining process? So I guess it's been a few weeks, maybe a few months now, time sure flies. We did a webinar on the lost art of process design where we talked about at least Navvia's perspective on an approach, and that actually designing a process is an art, and there's more to defining a process than opening it up, whatever your ITSM tool might be, and starting to customize screens and fields. So I'd like to get a little bit of insight from each of you as to what your organization does, or what you do as in terms of leading the team in defining and implementing process. I'm going to start with Vince. Vince?
Sure. So my organization is probably like a lot of other folks' organization. The historic approach, we had processes defined in lots of different areas, kind of each department, each group, whatever, had more of an ad hoc approach to process, right? So that ended up being very reactive, not very consistent in the definition. Being in IT, right, we're asked to automate a lot of different processes, right? When those stakeholders come to you, they think it's magic that you can just make something, take the inputs that they want to give you that aren't well defined, turn them magically into some output that is exactly what they want without that definition in there. So our organization really kind of took it from, we had an executive sponsor really for all process within the organization. My organization used to have the CFO was that executive sponsor, but we really weren't seeing that well-defined processes coming out of that. So I spoke to our CEO and really took on that role of executive sponsor. So what that allowed me to do is then bring a little more, for lack of a better word, order to the way we approach process. So we brought in some lean training. We brought in various groups relative to specific deliverables that they were trying to achieve, so processes that we're trying to get improvement on. We really approached it from a more holistic perspective of why are we really doing some of these items? What inputs, what outputs are you doing? Really defining the roles that go on with that. And then applying those lean techniques to start with the iterations to get continual process improvement. And we've got some great success stories to show from that, cost savings, items that are going, going through processes much quicker than they used to. We really kind of took out all the waste that was in those particular processes. Within IT itself, what we've done is we really adopted ITIL practices. We also have moved into ServiceNow and started automating a lot of the IT service management kind of processes within ServiceNow. And we're starting to be able to give much more visibility, much quicker response, much more accountable response, because you can see where something is in the process at this point, and it just brings that visibility. And transparency helps folks understand what's going on and understand really, what they're doing and how it impacts somebody downstream. So that, I guess that's it's a broad approach to process, but it seems to have had quite a bit of success within the organization.
Just a follow-up to that, Vince, you mentioned you're bringing some agile techniques into play for process design. Was value stream mapping part of that?
Correct. So what we've really done is I brought in lean training for everyone, or everyone involved in some process redesign. And I've run this, at this point, I'm running that a couple of times a year. And we really kind of pick a process that's going along with something that we are trying to automate. We're redefining the process ahead of time using value stream mapping, really kind of understanding what's there, what needs to be done, and really what waste there was in our existing processes. We, like a lot of folks, every one of the groups believed, oh, well, we've got to do ours differently. Once you get folks in a room and let them hash it out a little bit after they've been presented with lean techniques, they really start to understand, oh, what I'm doing isn't a lot different from somebody else. And wow, that impacts downline. That's why something's taking much longer. So I think that, again, it goes back to that education of process, waste, and really kind of how to look at it differently than what maybe historically our organization did.
If I had $1 for every time someone told me, oh, we can't conform to this process, we're so different than the other groups or the other teams or the other companies, I think I'd be a rich man today. Vesna, how about your organization? How do you go about defining process and implementing process and tools?
Before we picked our replacement tool for Remedy, we did a lot of heavy lifting on the process side at the get-go. So we started with selecting some process owners and managers, and then we were focusing on getting a baseline for the maturity of our processes. So we actually leveraged the process maturity module within Navvia to get that baseline. And then we ended up scheduling a series of workshops for each of the processes. So we spent about 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the process, going through and similar to what Ben said, just going through and having people hash out how they can follow the process and get some common ground between everyone. We agreed on it, we documented them. And then once we chose the tool, we were able to leverage that documentation to do the technical design. Mm-hmm. So that was really helpful for us when we started doing the implementation. And then once we did the training to teach people, we had a slide deck showing them the overall process, a very watered down version. We said, hey, this is the process, kind of introducing people to, this is the connection between the process and the tool and how you use it and how the steps flow together. And since we had that good foundation in the beginning, we haven't really had to touch that. Now it's more of going through and making some modifications and making it easier to use and saying, okay, this was on paper what we agreed on originally, but now what is actually in the reality of how people are using it and making modifications based off that. So it was great that we had that foundation in the beginning.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So you actually took the time to understand what you were trying to achieve before you went ahead and tried to automate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's unfortunately, that's not what everybody does these days, is it? Alan, how about yourself? I know you're doing a lot of great work at Columbia when it comes to implementing process.
Yeah, I mean, it helps when you approach these things, especially the large ITSM implementations across the IT organization. It helps to, bring in the right SMEs, the stakeholders, obviously look if there's already one group or one area that's performing it well, you definitely want to leverage that. But you have to go through the traditional steps, right? You have to ideally it's nice to do a process assessment, gather your requirements, design your process, your technical design, the tool configuration, right? The use cases testing, training, all that sort of thing. We have found ways to speed that up. There's always opportunity to improve that even better, but we try to approach it from that way because leaving or missing steps, we understand what the implications are from our experience, what happens if you skip any of those steps. But the one thing I would point out is that to make it so it's embedded as a practice, to really push toward institutionalizing it and getting some discipline around it, it's important to have established process ownership. That's not a silver bullet, but at the same time, it really helps from an accountability standpoint and from that continued improvement to have that process ownership defined up front and have them authorized and with the right authority. The other thing is obviously, I heard a few people mention that the alignment with industry standards, very important to do so, and to tie it to COVID where it's applicable. One thing I would share is that from a maturity standpoint, as you roll out multiple processes, one thing for us, it's an opportunity for improvement, is that we need to start tying those processes in from an oversight standpoint because they have to work in an integrated fashion for you to get the bang for the buck. But yes, I think for us, we try to approach it in that structured way in order to ensure that we do it right.
And didn't you have like a tremendous success story around change management where you saw some substantial savings in terms of taking that structured approach?
A lot of times the savings are somewhat anecdotal because if you didn't have anything before, it's hard to do a clean assessment of that. But yes, about 4 years ago, I believe, we rolled out change management. We did follow a very structured approach. We were able to bring, I think we had 19 people on the core team helping with the design. The good news, and we had established that process ownership up front. And I think of all of our processes, I think we have some discipline around that as an organization. There's always ways to improve, but I think we have followed that for other process implementations. And I think for us, that is something that we will continue to do.
That's great. Cecile, anything from the audience? Yes, actually, quite a few. A question, I think that's kind of a follow-on for some of Vince's comments. Bart has asked, with consideration for lean processes, to what level do process flows need to be documented? Did you want to take that, Vince?
Sure. So what we did, well, let me step back a second. One thing that I think we've all maybe implied but haven't explicitly stated is really you've got to get stakeholders and different levels of individuals involved in any kind of process work. You don't understand what's going on in a process unless you've talked to some of the folks that are on the front line, some of the folks that are then consuming the output from those processes, and all the way up to whatever reporting or whatever you need to do at some kind of management level. We really allowed the value stream mapping process to document to as much detail as we were able to collect at that point in time. Obviously, that may not be enough detail to automate everything. There's some other information you might need to research or work with specific groups to get a little bit more detail. But we really tried to, in those events that we did, the Kaizen type event, we tried to go down to as much detail as our participants were able to bring, and we sent them back to get further detail if it was lacking in a particular area. And I think one of the important things for this is those individuals were very bought in to this shared developed process, and they were much more willing to follow it after the fact.
Engagement really drives adoption, doesn't it?
That's correct.
Very good. Anything else, Cecile, from the audience?
I do. I have something that's tied to some of the things that Vesna was talking about earlier. Henry asked, as Vesna was talking, Henry had asked, do you emphasize validating your processes prior to automation? So, and then, what happens, or what do you say to if you automate a bad process? Doesn't that just create bad outcomes faster?
Vesna?
Can you repeat the first about the validating?
Yeah. Do you emphasize that it's important to validate your processes prior to starting to try to automate them?
Yes. So we validated it with a steering committee, who obviously is not the people that are on the ground doing the work, but the people that were involved in the workshops that we held, they were all stakeholders of, like for incident, we had people from various different groups that were kind of the representative for that group. And it was their responsibility to take back to the work groups the progress of the process and gather the feedback and then bring it back to the workshops. And then we went through, at the end of the workshop, we went through another validation process where we brought in people to hear the process and also give final input. So there were a few steps of validation for the process. And then once we implemented that into the tool, we had a bunch of UAT sessions to have people chime in. And then we also did that again. So when we implemented it originally, we've implemented incident, problem, change, knowledge, and request. And for every time we implemented one of the modules, we ended up taking that to UAT. So we did UAT for the central IT, and then once we rolled it into the distributed groups, we also gathered their feedback and made sure that it was working for everybody before we finally pushed it out to all the other groups. So we had some early adopters, is what we call them. So not only central IT, but these distributed groups. So we try to cover as much ground as possible.
Excellent. Alan, Vince, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would just say that as long as I think the first part of the question was about bad process and ensuring that you don't go out and automate a bad process. I think you can stay out of trouble. To add to what Vesna said, in terms of making sure you have several points of validation, making sure that you have engagement with your SMEs and all your stakeholders, make sure you align with the industry standards too. That kind of keeps you out of trouble. And then the last thing I would say is keep it simple in the beginning, and then through continuous improvement, add on to it. But I think those steps will keep you out of trouble.
Good advice. All right, we'll move on to the next question. And for that, I'm going to start with Vesna. And it actually ties into some of the stuff you've been speaking to. Out of the box, I mean, vendors these days are always pushing, don't spend time defining your processes, use the processes that are defined within the tool, use the tool out of the box. And the number of times that, I've come across this is amazing. But at least in my experience, it seldom works. Let me ask the question to the panel here. Does out-of-the-box process automation work for you? Why and why not? Vesna?
No, that's the short answer. No.
Right?
And I meant like school of medicine was one of our early adopters when we rolled out incident and request, and they brought in with a lot of feedback. And all these distributed IT groups that are scattered around Stanford, they all have their own procedures, they all have their own focus, and they all have their own funding. So they're used to customizing things to work for them. And it makes sense. The medical school is focusing on learning and technologies that support medical research. And us in central IT, we're focused on enterprise systems and infrastructures. So we really needed to be flexible and try to accommodate everyone. And we actually didn't need to customize it as much as we expected, because once people started to use the tool and realized, hey, this is working for us, then like Alan said, then you focus on trying to make things, improve on the things that you've already implemented. And we've actually had a lot of success with our partners. They're really working well with us and partnering with us and understanding that, hey, this isn't perfect, but we're going to try to accommodate you guys as much as possible and tweak things where we need to and strike that balance. So it's actually been working out okay for us. And now that we're bringing in these non-IT groups starting in January of 2018, we're trying to do the same thing, trying to be flexible, but trying not to customize it too much. And we're working with each one of these. We've been working with student services, HR, our financial teams to say, you guys are the non-IT groups. We need to focus on trying to find a common ground across you guys. And they're much harder than, the university IT and the central and distributed groups, because they are all doing something slightly different. So it's getting a little more challenging there, but we're trying not to heavily customize anything. And we're really focusing on the user experience. We have a whole team dedicated to that. So they're going out to not only the fulfillers, but the end users who are consuming the processes and conducting some interviews and taking back that feedback and helping us try to improve on both ends for the fulfiller and the end users.
Would you say the 80-20 rule applies here? Sort of like you're able to keep 80%, but customize 20% on top of that?
I think so. For the IT groups, actually, I believe that. We'll see with the non-IT groups. I think where it's going to be a little more challenging, but I think actually for the IT groups, we've done pretty well.
And one of the things,
just jinx us.
No, well, one of the things too that people get confused about when we throw these terms customize or configure around. So, I mean, I don't think anyone these days wants to do customization where you're actually writing code on top of the platform. A lot of it is using the platform itself and configuring it and using the capabilities of the platform to deal with these, edge cases or unique requirements. So when you're talking about, customization, are you talking about customization, configuration, or a bit of both?
A little bit of both. So we try to stick to configuration as much as possible, but just the way that we're set up, we have so many different business units and departments. There's been some customizations that we've had to make, and there's also been some workarounds that we've done so we wouldn't have to customize it. So we're using the technology and we're just slightly tweaking it to accommodate us without having to over customize.
Very good. Alan, how about you guys at Columbia?
It's out the box, just being able to use out the box is atypical. It's not what usually happens. I mean, you just have so many other factors you have to take into consideration. Your culture of your organization, the operating model, the organizational structure, the different constraints that different groups have. There's also a different emphasis sometimes in terms of what's driving the process implementation. For example, if you had a major breach, a security breach, then your focus may be more on security than speed, right? I mean, so there's just, and also, so out the box, unless you have like a clean slate and you can just adapt and deploy, it's just not the way it usually goes. But that being said, you'd like to keep it as simple as possible and vanilla as possible, but it's rare that you just pull it out the box and you can just stand it up and you can run and everything's fine.
You raised a good point. Immature organizations or smaller organizations that have very little in place would benefit significantly adopting something out of the box if they have nothing today. But, when you look at perhaps, if you look at the makeup of the people on today's call, most of these organizations have a legacy of process, a legacy of IT. So it's much harder when you have a lot of things in place and some history there to be able to, you know, just take a clean slate approach. So, Vince, anything you want to add?
Sure. I think a large portion of how much you can use configuration as opposed to customization is really related to something Eiland mentioned earlier, which is how closely you're following best practices. If your organization is really far away from best practices, none of the tools are really going to be anywhere close to what you're used to doing. And then you have a culture problem of shifting folks to a more industry practice. Sometimes that makes the tool get a bad reputation. Sometimes that is, you know, it's a change management problem, right? Sometimes you've got to get folks closer to industry practice before you implement one of the tools. We don't usually, we're not able to use out of the box always. Like Vesna and Eiland both said, we try to stick as close as we can, because if you deviate too far or customize too much within the tool, you're not really able to take advantage of new versions that come along that may actually address some of the shortcomings that you might have. That simple implementation to begin with the customization and or configuration that you need to get you there, and then provide feedback to the vendors. They're looking for feedback on how their tool can best work, because they want every organization to be successful at using their tool, because you continue to purchase the tool if you're successful at using it. Very good. So I, straight out of the box, yeah, that's not going to happen for an organization that's been around a long time, but you really want to get to those best practices and tools that align to the best practice that you've chosen, and that minimizes your need to customize.
Thank you. Cecile, anything you'd like to add from the audience?
Yeah, sure. There's actually been a couple of comments, you know, what kind of ownership are we seeing in terms of the practitioners involved, the process owners and the process managers? How do you improve the engagement from those folks? Because a lot of times, one of the audience members made the comment, you know, the folks here expect our service management office to do all the work. So how do you get people to be engaged and take accountability?
Does anyone want to take that question?
We get a lot of feedback. Sorry. We get a lot of feedback from our campus partners, so that's one avenue, but our process managers and our process owners are really engaged in the day-to-day operations. So they kind of understand where the pain points are, and they have a really good relationship with some of the other groups. So they're pretty engaged, but we also have our service design team that goes out and talks to people to try to see how they're working with the processes and try to find out where they can leverage some improvement. So the process owners and managers were really engaged in the beginning, but they're sort of transitioning from that, and it's becoming the service design team responsibility. But I agree, they expect everyone in the service management office, and everybody wants their preferences to be addressed and implemented. So yeah, it's challenging.
Vince, you know, in your discussion about the lean training and the value stream mapping, it sounded like that was a great technique to get some of these people who might have been on the fence engaged and involved. Would you agree with that?
It's definitely a great technique. The first time any of those individuals go through that, they are very apprehensive. They're very resistant, right? My way has got to be the best. My way is unique. Whatever their story going into that is. You really have to influence them a little bit to get them to try it out. The interesting thing that happened for us when I brought that in is those folks were excited about improving other processes after they had had a success in one process. Mm-hmm. And so I think you've really got to build upon those those individuals that have had success stories, tell some of those success stories, involve those folks into your team. And you know, the other thing that kind of works and doesn't work is we used a particular facilitator to help with that. That was basically an impartial party. That helps stop any animosity from ownership or you know, protectionism or whatever you want to call it. That happens when if you don't have somebody that's more impartial, that's really facilitating that value stream mapping or whatever. And the individual that you choose needs to be very aligned with what you're trying to achieve. If you bring lean into your organization, you've got the individuals that are all for the process improvement and the experimentation to get those incremental improvements, but everybody has to be working toward a similar larger goal, and that team has to really understand what that goal is at the end.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Vince. This next question, I'm going to start with Eiland. I mean, Eiland, you mentioned earlier in today's presentation the importance of governance and control of the processes once they're in place. Could you talk a little more to what your organization's approach is in terms of process improvement and governance?
It's a journey. I think what we have succeeded in doing is that we've identified at least the process owner, process management. I think they are responsible in some ways for driving the adherence to the process. I think the key thing, though, is as you roll out multiple processes, you have to ensure that those process owners are aligned. Again, I mentioned earlier, for you to reap the rewards and collect the dividends from a whole ITSM initiative, with process being very key to what you're trying to do, it's very important that you have that alignment and that they're working in an integrated fashion and they're not doing things in a silo. So I think the challenge for the SMO office, right, is to bring that alignment and make sure that the process owners understand that it's important for them to work with the other different areas, right? And so that's very, very important. I think that's an area for us that we have made some progress on, but we still have to continue to work on. But I think that's the key thing. I think another thing that I would point out to folks is that if your processes are subject to either internal or external audit, I think that is a big key driver. And I see our audit and internal compliance and external compliance as a partner. You know, be careful though, right? I mean, no one wants to be audited, right? No one wants to go through that process. But I think there are dividends that are achieved when you subject it to that audit, because I think it gives it a way for you to, one, measure how you're doing, but then two, drive for an adherence and to get the organization to kind of pay attention.
You mentioned COBIT in your one of your earlier remarks. Is that something that you're using internally?
Oh, definitely. Absolutely. For the processes we roll out, we tie it to the respective COBIT controls, and the process owners take the ownership of making sure that they are aligned with those COBIT controls, and then if they are subject to audit, then they will produce the evidence against those COBIT controls.
Excellent. Vince, how about yourself? What is your organization's approach?
Well, I agree with pretty much the comments that Eiland made. Improvement and governance is really a journey, and getting folks to continue with process improvement, right, on top of anything else that they might have doing. Even those folks that are very strong supporters of process improvement and things get overwhelmed at times with other things in their job, and keeping people where they're actually contributing back and making suggestions becomes really a tough job in and of itself sometimes. I agree with the alignment to your audit controls and picking the correct tools that you need to align to back kind of that industry best practices. As far as governance, everybody's got what they're trying to do, keeping folks to kind of stick to process, not grant a lot of exceptions, whatever the case may be. It's continual work.
Vesna, is there anything you'd like to add?
We have the same challenge as Alan and Vince in their group, but one thing that we've done to try to work that through all of that is we set up a governance group called our Process Council, and that meets bi-weekly, and their job is basically to clear any roadblocks. And there's so many touch points between the different processes that we wanted to have a forum for people to be able to discuss changes that they're proposing, because a process owner might say, hey, I want this done for my process, but not realizing that the impact that it might have on another process. So that's the forum where they bring that type of information so people can chime in, and there's some executive representation in that group. So if we need to escalate anything up, we can do that. And we're also, I said that before about using KPIs and metrics to tell the story, because people might be bringing in perspective and chattering to some of the executives, this is what's going on. And we really need that data to say, this is a problem area, not this. So we know where to throw some of our resources for improving. But pretty much what Vince and Eiland said for everything else.
Very good. So we have about 7 or 8 minutes left in today's webinar. And again, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for the great input that you've provided. We're going to end on a question that sort of looks towards the future. And so that question is, what do you see as the future of process design in your organization? Alan, why don't we start with you, and we'll then move on to Vince and Vesna.
For us, it's just a constant of reality that velocity. I will say it that way. Velocity is really defining and driving our world. The velocity and the increased velocity of delivering services and value to our customers. So with that being said, and think about it for a second, the consumer experience is really now the benchmark, fair or not fair. That is what we all have to kind of aspire to. But yeah, that's critical to our success. And so with that, there are changes occurring with the demand for both Agile and DevOps. We have to increase the frequency and the speed that delivery. You must have and you're going to have a tight process in order to do that. For you to automate, for you to leverage Agile, for you to leverage DevOps, for you to really improve how you deliver services and deliver iteratively and with high frequency, you really have to have a tight process. So for us, process is going to be critical. Designing a process and making sure that process can be automated is going to be, I think, probably top of our agenda.
I think it's really important to emphasize one of the points you just made. To be able to do things faster and better, you have to have process. You can't just do that in an ad hoc fashion. And sometimes people think that these frameworks like DevOps or Agile puts process to the side, but without process, you'll actually start implement. And I think it came up, someone I think in the audience said, you don't want to start implementing bad things quicker. You want to be able to do the right things quicker. Vince, how about yourself? What do you see as the future of process in your organization?
Well, I really kind of echo Alan's sentiment, right? That the speed of change in the consumer segment definitely sets the stage for what your stakeholders expect. What they don't necessarily realize is what went into building that experience beforehand. Folks, yes, do believe that process is a hindrance until they've really kind of experienced what you truly mean by process. So it's that education and the benefits that process brings. I know folks like to say, hey, lean is something different. Lean is a process improvement methodology. Agile Agile is really just an implementation of lean on development practices. DevOps, really it's just taking that a little bit further. They're all rooted in process, and process isn't the item you're pushing through, it's how you pushed it through. And folks just kind of have to switch their perspective a little bit.
You know,
go ahead.
I was just going to say customer experience. You know, when you look at some of the leading customer service organizations, you know, whether you walk into an Apple store or a Starbucks, that doesn't happen by accident. How you're treated, how the store is laid out, the flow, the interactions, all of those things are scripted by process, and it's designed to deliver certain outcomes, either you purchasing more or coming back again and again. And, you know, the better your process, the more effortless it seems. And it goes to the point that both you and Alan made, people don't realize the amount of work that goes behind that good customer experience.
Correct. So I think process improvement and the iteration becomes much more important. Being able to benchmark what worked, what didn't work, and what kind of improvement that actually following that process made on the organization, I think are really where that future of keeping process alive is.
Thanks. Vesna?
Yeah, similar to what they're saying. I mean, it's now looking at the tools that we need to support the process. You know, if we can get something to help with categorizing incidents, that'll make that process a lot more efficient. We have a problem with unauthorized changes. We don't find out about it until something happens. So getting some discovery tools or something that can detect things going on beforehand, and then not having an impact on customers at the end, you know, if there's some outage or something that happened because of an unauthorized change. So for us, it's, you know, we've got a good foundation, but now it's just making improvements, making things quicker, making things faster. And the only way to do that is keep trying to get some tools and enhancements for our processes.
Great, thank you so much. We do have a few moments left. We're open to taking any additional questions or comments for our panel. Cecile?
Sure. Let me pick one. I have to pick one because there's been lots of additional questions. So for folks who were on today's session, thank you for your comments and your questions. We addressed quite a few of them. There are still some that we have. If we don't have enough time to complete everything today, as David mentioned, we will follow up with you and ensure that we do so. Just a few comments from people, you know, that a lot of people don't understand the difference between process and procedures. Does an out-of-the-box tool culture foster silos? How do you put emphasis on process owner and accountability? So I think we've covered quite a few of these here today. Actually, I did have one set of questions from Ross, and he was asking, you know, anybody have any data around the amount of effort that winds up being spent on the technology, the technical versus the process work when you're implementing something in a tool? You know, what percentage of the time are you spending on the process work versus the actual technical configuration work? If somebody would like to speak to that.
In my
sorry, go ahead, Alan.
Okay. In my previous experience before I came to Columbia, we had a clarity system that everyone had, and that's a resource tracking tool. And so with that, we were able to do analysis on a few of our implementations. And it came out that on the process design piece, it accounted for over 30% of our time and effort. If that helps. Again, that was specific to one organization. I don't have industry standards, but that's anecdotal, but that's something that we were able to quantify.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree, though, that time spent up front minimizes rework?
I'm in the project management space, absolutely, yes.
Anyone else want to comment on that question?
I think for us, it was about the same. Like, we had the process workshops, and then shortly after we had some technical design workshops, which I think ended up being about the same, like 1 to 2 weeks. I mean, of course, you've got the development work and all the back and forth and testing, but I think the actual design pieces ended up about equaling each other.
Thanks.
For the design portion.
Well,
we see
ahead,
anywhere
guys.
from 30 to 50% probably is in that upfront work. Something we actually see is that a lot of times once folks really kind of work out some of the process, some of the requests go away because they were asking for a whole automation or a tool set to do something that really was wasted effort to begin with. And so you've also got to look at not just the time you spent in the implementation of that process, but also the avoided work that you might have had, so that wastage that you saved.
Well, I can't believe how quick the time has gone by. We're just a minute or so over the scheduled period. So I want to take this opportunity, Eiland, Vince, Vesna, to thank you so much for being part of today's discussion. For those in the audience, a recording will be made available, and we'll go through all the comments and questions. And if there's anything we need to follow up on, we will definitely do that. Also, I just want to take another moment to talk a little bit about the Navvia tool. The Navvia tool is designed to help organizations assess, design, document, and share their processes, also govern the processes. We do have a weekly demo of the Navvia Process Designer at navvia.com/demo. So if you're interested at all, take a look at navvia.com/demo, and maybe you'll have some interest in the product. So on that note, I want to thank everyone, the audience especially, for their time, as well as the panel. Thank you so much for being part of today's webinar, and we look forward to see you on a future webinar. Thank you all so much, and Cecile, thank you for being such a great host today.
Thanks, David. Thanks very much, everybody.
All right, bye, everyone.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lots of thanks from the audience, by the way. So thanks again, guys. All right, bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.